There are four threats to the human race: the pandemic, weapons of mass destruction, climate change, and cyber. The Federal Reserve in New York holds trillions of dollars kept by banks around the world. The criminals can't hack the network system of the Fed, so they turn their attention to a more vulnerable target, the Bangladesh Bank.
The story begins on a quiet Thursday night, February 4, 2016, at the Central Bank of Bangladesh. It was a typical evening. As usual, the employees had wrapped up their work, locked the bank, and gone home for the weekend. But unbeknownst to them, a massive digital heist was unfolding, a heist that would later be known as one of the largest in history. In the background, a highly organized and skillful group of cybercriminals had gained access to the bank's internal systems. Their target, the billions of dollars in reserves the central bank held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The attackers, later linked to a notorious hacking group suspected of being supported by a powerful state, were not ordinary thieves. They were experts in exploiting weaknesses in highly secure digital systems, and on this night, they were ready to execute their long-planned heist. In Bangladesh, the weekend falls on Friday and Saturday, meaning the bank would be largely inactive during those days. Only essential employees, mostly those handling international transactions, would be at work. The hackers had chosen this timing carefully, knowing that the bank would be operating with minimal staff and that communication with international partners would be slow. This would give them the window of time they needed to carry out their plan undetected. Most people outside the banking sector are familiar with the SWIFT system, or SWIFT code, even if only vaguely. SWIFT, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a Belgian company that provides a secure global network for banks around the world to communicate with each other. It is the backbone of international banking. For example, if someone in Bangladesh wanted to send money to someone in the United States, the transaction would be processed through SWIFT. No physical money moves, but the SWIFT system ensures that the transaction is accurately recorded and confirmed between banks. Given the importance of SWIFT to the global banking system, it is designed with tight security. The system itself has proven to be incredibly difficult to breach. However, this heist wasn't about breaking into SWIFT. The hackers knew that was an impossible task. Instead, they found a more vulnerable target, the internal security systems of the Central Bank of Bangladesh. On Thursday evening, as the regular staff left for the weekend, the bank's digital systems continued to operate. International transfers would still be processed as they always were, with a log of these transactions recorded digitally and automatically printed on paper as a backup. The bank's SWIFT system operated 24 hours a day, so there was no reason for employees to suspect anything unusual. But by Friday morning, things began to take a strange turn. Friday, February 5, 2016, began like any other day for the essential staff at the central bank. One of their tasks was to check the printer for records of the international transfers that had occurred overnight. The employee responsible for this duty expected the printer to be busy, as transfers would have been processed through the night, even if they were executed in the early hours. However, to his surprise, there were no documents waiting for him in the printer tray. The lack of printed receipts was puzzling. It seemed highly unlikely that no international transfers had occurred overnight. These transactions were usually routine, even during quieter periods. Concerned but not yet panicking, the staff member checked the digital logs on the computer. The log showed that transactions had indeed occurred, and nothing seemed out of place, except for the fact that the printer had failed to generate the corresponding documents. The employees spent most of the day trying to troubleshoot the issue. They assumed it was a simple technical glitch. The printer had been known to malfunction occasionally, so no one suspected that anything more serious was going on. After hours of effort, they were still unable to fix the problem. The printer wouldn't even turn on, despite their best attempts. By the end of the day, they decided to leave it for the weekend. Since the technical staff weren't considered essential, they wouldn't return until Sunday, the first working day of the week in Bangladesh. The following day, Saturday, the skeleton crew returned to the bank and continued their efforts to fix the printer. They tried everything they could think of, but the machine remained stubbornly silent. However, after several hours of work, the printer suddenly roared to life. Without warning, it began printing out all the accumulated transfer records from Thursday night to Saturday morning. What the employees saw next shocked them. Among the printed transactions were 35 transfers that had not been recorded in the digital log on the computer. These unauthorized transactions amounted to a staggering $951 million, nearly $1 billion. The staff were stunned. Where had these transactions come from, and why weren't they showing up in the digital system? A deeper review of the situation revealed the horrifying truth. The bank's SWIFT system had been used to send transfer requests to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where the Central Bank of Bangladesh held billions of dollars in reserves. The SWIFT request directed the Federal Reserve to transfer nearly $1 billion to various bank accounts in the Philippines. Panic set in. The employees had no idea how these transfers had been initiated or who had authorized them. Their primary concern now was to stop the damage before it was too late. They quickly reviewed the transfer logs and discovered that 4 of the transactions, totaling $81 million, had already been processed and sent to accounts in the Philippines. The remaining 31 transfers, which made up the bulk of the nearly $1 billion, had not yet been processed by the Federal Reserve. The bank employees knew they had to act fast. Their first priority was to prevent the remaining $870 million from being transferred out of their accounts at the Federal Reserve. They immediately tried to contact the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to alert them to the fraudulent transfers and halt the processing of any further requests. But there was a problem. It was Saturday in the United States, and the Federal Reserve offices were closed for the weekend. No one would be available to respond until Monday morning. The central bank staff then reached out to SWIFT, the organization responsible for the transfers, to seek guidance. SWIFT advised the bank to immediately shut down its transfer system to prevent any further unauthorized transactions. However, shutting down the system required approval from the central bank's director. When the employees contacted the director to inform him of the situation, they were met with an unexpected and frustrating response. The director dismissed their concerns, suggesting that the issue might be a minor error that would resolve itself once the technical staff returned to work on Sunday. He refused to authorize the shutdown of the transfer system, believing that the situation didn't warrant such drastic measures. This dismissive attitude would prove costly. Even if the director had acted with the urgency the situation required, it might not have made much difference. By Sunday, the damage had already been done. The following day, the central bank employees and the director returned to work. However, because it was still the weekend in the United States, they were unable to establish contact with the Federal Reserve to confirm whether the remaining transfers had been processed. They would have to wait until Monday to get any answers. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the $81 million that had already been transferred was now sitting in accounts at a bank in the Philippines. The central bank staff made multiple attempts to contact the Philippine bank involved in the transactions, hoping to freeze the accounts and prevent the thieves from accessing the stolen funds. However, it was also the weekend in the Philippines, and the bank's offices were closed. To make matters worse, Monday, February 8th, was a public holiday in the Philippines, Chinese New Year. Because of the strong cultural ties between the Philippines and China, Chinese New Year is widely observed in the country, and most businesses, including banks, remain closed. This meant that the Central Bank of Bangladesh wouldn't be able to communicate with the Philippine bank until Tuesday, February 9th. By this point, a clearer picture of the heist was beginning to emerge. The thieves had carefully planned their operation to exploit the overlapping weekend schedules in Bangladesh, the United States, and the Philippines. They had executed the theft on a Thursday night, knowing that the U.S. Federal Reserve would be on a weekend break on Saturday and Sunday, and that the banks in the Philippines would be closed for 3 days due to the holiday. This meticulously timed heist had given the thieves a significant head start, allowing them to move the money before anyone could stop them. After all their attempts at direct communication failed, the Central Bank of Bangladesh was left with no choice but to send emails to the Philippine bank. In their emails, they explained that the $81 million transferred into the accounts had been stolen and requested that the bank immediately freeze the accounts to prevent the thieves from withdrawing the funds. The clock was ticking, and the employees at the Central Bank of Bangladesh were running out of options. Time was slipping away, and the longer the situation went unresolved, the more likely it became that the stolen funds would disappear for good. For Bangladesh, a country that struggled with poverty and economic instability, losing nearly $1 billion would be a catastrophic blow. The stolen funds represented a significant portion of the country's national reserves, and the economic repercussions of such a loss would be severe. As the bank's management watched the situation unfold, they felt helpless, unsure of how to contain the disaster. Before delving further into what happened after the theft, it's important to understand how the hackers managed to breach the central bank's transfer system in the first place. The hackers initially targeted the U.S. Federal Reserve because it held part of the reserves of many countries, including Bangladesh. However, breaching the Federal Reserve's systems was nearly impossible. The same could be said for the SWIFT system, which had a reputation for being one of the most secure networks in the world. But every network, no matter how secure, is only as strong as its weakest link. And in this case, the weakest link was the Central Bank of Bangladesh. Each bank connected to the SWIFT network is responsible for its internal security. And while the SWIFT network itself was nearly impenetrable, the internal systems of individual banks could vary widely in terms of security sophistication. For hackers looking for a way in, the internal security systems of a less well-resourced bank like Bangladesh's could present an easier target. Breaching the Central Bank of Bangladesh's system wasn't easy, and it certainly didn't happen overnight. The hackers had infiltrated the bank more than a year before the day of the heist. Over the course of that year, they had covertly monitored the bank's network, analyzing its systems from the inside, and gaining a deep understanding of how the bank processed its international transfers. The first step in the hackers' plan was to gather information on the bank's employees, a process known as social engineering. Social engineering involves studying and manipulating human behavior to gain access to secure systems. In the digital age, social media is the most effective tool for hackers engaging in social engineering. Many people freely share personal information online, which can be exploited by those with malicious intent. In this case, the hackers gathered information on approximately 40 employees at the Central Bank of Bangladesh. They used this information to craft emails that appeared to come from people the employees knew, contacts they had interacted with on social media. These emails were designed to appear completely legitimate. Most of them were simple job inquiries, asking if the employee could help find a job at the bank and including an attached resume. The attachment was the key. It appeared to be a harmless PDF file, but in reality, it contained a virus. When the employees opened the attachment, the virus quietly installed itself on their computers. These emails were sent to the employees' work addresses, which meant they were likely opened on work computers. Once the virus was on the system, it began to spread throughout the bank's network. The virus remained undetected as it spread. The employees had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. After all, they had simply opened what looked like an ordinary resume. But behind the scenes, the virus was doing far more than just sitting on their computers. Once the virus was in place, it allowed the hackers to monitor everything that happened on the infected computers. They could capture screenshots, record every keystroke the employees made, and even take control of the computers remotely. But at this stage, the hackers weren't ready to execute their attack. They were still in the information gathering phase. Their ultimate goal was to gain access to the bank's most critical systems, specifically the computers responsible for handling international money transfers through the SWIFT network. However, not every computer in the bank had access to the SWIFT system. Like most modern banks, the Central Bank of Bangladesh's computers were connected through a network. Normally, these internal networks have security standards in place to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive systems. The device that connects computers within a network, called a switch, is usually configured with strict security measures, especially in financial institutions. But in this case, the switches at the Central Bank of Bangladesh were not up to the task. They were cheap and poorly configured, lacking the robust security standards that would have prevented the hackers from moving through the network. As a result, the hackers were able to move from one computer to another relatively easily until they found the computer they were looking for, the one responsible for international transfers. This computer was their main target, and only a few employees, perhaps 2 or 3, had access to it. The hackers' movements were cautious and deliberate. They knew that if any employee noticed something suspicious, their entire operation could be jeopardized. That's why it took them about a year to reach their target. They had to ensure that every step of the way was covered. Eventually, they succeeded. They gained access to the computer responsible for the bank's international transfers, and once they had the login credentials of the employees who used that computer, they were ready to execute their plan. After more than a year of preparation, the hackers were ready to strike. They chose their timing carefully, as mentioned earlier. The plan was to launch the attack on Thursday night, February 4th, 2016. This timing would give them the maximum amount of time to complete their operation before anyone noticed that something was wrong. At 8:30 p.m., after the bank's employees had left for the day, the hackers remotely accessed the computer responsible for international transfers. Using the credentials they had stolen, they logged into the bank's SWIFT system and submitted 35 transfer requests to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The total value of these transactions was approximately $951 million, nearly $1 billion. The requests were directed to various accounts in the Philippines, all of which had been set up months earlier by the hackers. It was now 10:30 a.m. in New York, and the Federal Reserve staff were at work as usual. From their perspective, everything seemed normal. The SWIFT system had authenticated the requests, and all the necessary details appeared to be correct. There was no reason for them to deny the transfers, even though the amounts involved were unusually large. The hackers sent the 35 requests and waited for a response from the Federal Reserve. However, something unexpected happened. Of the 35 transfer requests submitted by the hackers, only 4 of them were accepted. These 4 transactions, totaling $81 million, were sent to the designated accounts in the Philippines, while the remaining 31 transactions, which amounted to an additional $870 million, were suspended and placed under review by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. For the hackers, this was an unforeseen complication. The situation was puzzling for them. Why had only 4 of the transactions gone through? Everything had been planned meticulously, down to the smallest detail. The SWIFT system, which processes the transfers, had authenticated all the requests. So why weren't the rest of the transfers processed? What the hackers didn't know was that they had been foiled by a bizarre coincidence, a stroke of luck that would end up saving the Central Bank of Bangladesh from losing nearly $1 billion. The reason why the remaining 31 transfers were suspended was tied to something that had nothing to do with the Bangladesh bank or the hackers themselves. The accounts in the Philippines, where the hackers had directed the funds, were under the names of individuals from China. These accounts had been opened about 10 months prior to the heist and had remained dormant until that fateful day when millions of dollars suddenly began flowing into them. The accounts were located at RCBC, Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, a prominent bank in the Philippines, and were spread across multiple branches, including one situated on a street called Jupiter. The word Jupiter was at the heart of the coincidence that would derail the hackers' plans. In another part of the world, completely unrelated to the Bangladesh bank heist, there existed a maritime oil shipping company called Jupiter that was involved in business dealings with Iran. Due to U.S. sanctions on Iran, this company had been placed on a blacklist, meaning any financial transaction involving the name Jupiter was subject to additional scrutiny by U.S. financial institutions, including the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The hackers had no way of knowing about this unrelated company, and the mere fact that one of the branches of RCBC where the stolen funds were to be deposited was located on Jupiter Street triggered an alert at the Federal Reserve. The system flagged the transactions as potentially related to a sanctioned entity and placed them under review. This stroke of luck, this accidental connection between a bank branch on Jupiter Street in the Philippines and a sanctioned shipping company in a completely different industry, was what saved the Central Bank of Bangladesh from losing an additional $870 million. It was a coincidence so bizarre that it almost seemed miraculous. Thanks to this strange twist of fate, the 31 remaining transfers were halted, and the Bangladesh bank was spared from suffering a catastrophic financial loss. The $81 million that had already been transferred was still a significant amount, but it was nothing compared to what the hackers had intended to steal. Had the 31 other transfers been processed, the consequences for Bangladesh could have been devastating, with the country potentially losing a major portion of its national reserves. This wasn't the only stroke of luck that helped mitigate the damage caused by the heist. After the 4 transfers were processed, the hackers remained inside the bank's system, waiting for confirmation that the remaining transactions had also gone through. They waited for about 7.5 hours, monitoring the system and ensuring that everything was proceeding according to plan. At around 6 p.m. New York time, they assumed that the workday was over and that the remaining transfers would not be processed until the next day. Believing that their job was done, the hackers exited the SWIFT system and severed their connection to the Bangladesh bank's network. But in doing so, they made a critical mistake. Had the hackers waited just 1 more hour, they could have completed the theft. Some employees at the Federal Reserve were still at work, reviewing the transactions that had been flagged for additional scrutiny. When they saw that the flagged transactions were linked to Jupiter Street in the Philippines and realized that this was unrelated to the sanctioned Jupiter Shipping Company, they determined that the freeze had been a system error. Normally, the Federal Reserve relies entirely on the SWIFT system for processing international transactions. As long as a transfer request comes through the SWIFT network and all the details are accurate, there is usually no reason to reject the request, no matter how large the sum involved. If the hackers had still been connected to the system when the Federal Reserve lifted the hold on the remaining 31 transactions, they could have easily confirmed them and completed the theft. But by the time the freeze was lifted, the hackers were gone. After noticing that the remaining 31 transfers from the Central Bank of Bangladesh had been flagged by mistake, the Federal Reserve employees reviewed the enormous sums involved. They found it unusual that such large amounts were being transferred to the Philippines and decided to seek additional confirmation from the Bangladesh bank before proceeding. The Federal Reserve sent a message through the SWIFT system itself, requesting confirmation of the transfers. Were the transactions legitimate? Were the amounts correct? Had the hackers still been inside the Bangladesh bank system at this point, they could have easily responded to the Federal Reserve's request. They could have used the SWIFT system to confirm the transfers, thereby affirming them as legitimate. Once the confirmation had been received, the Federal Reserve would have had no reason to withhold the remaining $870 million, and the full amount would have been transferred to the hackers' accounts in the Philippines. But as fate would have it, the hackers had logged out of the system just an hour before the Federal Reserve sent its request for confirmation. Before the hackers exited the system, they made sure to cover their tracks as thoroughly as possible. They deleted all records of the 35 transactions they had initiated from the bank's digital transaction log, ensuring that when the bank's staff arrived the next day, they would be completely unaware of what had happened. The hackers had studied the bank's internal systems for months and knew that the bank kept both digital and physical records of international transfers. To delay the discovery of their fraudulent transactions, the hackers had disabled the printer that automatically printed out all international transfer records as they occurred. By infecting the printer with malware, they ensured that it would not generate any physical records of the transfers, making it much harder for the bank's employees to detect the heist. When the skeleton crew of essential employees arrived at the bank on Friday morning, as mentioned earlier, they found the printer out of service. No papers had been printed, and the digital log on the computer showed no suspicious transactions, just the routine daily transfers. At this point, the employees assumed that the issue was nothing more than a printer malfunction, and made no connection between the printer problem and any potential breach of the bank's systems. It wasn't until Saturday, when the employees finally managed to get the printer working again, that the true scale of the disaster was revealed. As the printer churned out pages and pages of accumulated transfer records, the bank staff was shocked to see 35 transfers totaling nearly $1 billion, transactions that had not been recorded in the digital log. The management of the Central Bank of Bangladesh quickly realized that they had been the victims of a massive cyber heist, but by then, it was too late. The $81 million that had already been transferred to the Philippines was gone, and they had no way of stopping it. In the aftermath of the discovery, the management of the Central Bank of Bangladesh sprang into action. They attempted to contact the Federal Reserve in the United States and RCBC in the Philippines to stop the thieves from withdrawing the stolen funds. However, due to the timing of the heist and the overlapping holidays, they were met with silence. The employees of RCBC were still on holiday, celebrating the Chinese New Year, and the bank's offices were closed. Desperate, the Bangladesh bank sent a series of urgent emails to the Philippine bank, requesting that the accounts containing the stolen $81 million be frozen immediately. In the emails, they explained that the funds had been stolen from their account at the Federal Reserve and that the transfers had been carried out illegally. But by this point, the thieves were already in motion. As the Central Bank of Bangladesh scrambled to contain the damage, they reviewed their internal security camera footage in an attempt to figure out how the fraudulent transactions had been initiated. Initially, the bank's management suspected that an actual person had physically entered the bank, accessed the computer connected to the SWIFT system, and manually executed the transfers from within the building. They spent over 8 hours poring over security footage, but to their shock, the only person who appeared on the recordings was a janitor. There was no evidence that anyone had physically breached the bank's secure areas, and no one had been seen accessing the computers responsible for international transfers. It was at this point that the bank's management began to realize the true nature of the attack. This wasn't a physical heist. It was a highly sophisticated cyber intrusion. The hackers had managed to infiltrate the bank's network without leaving a single physical trace, a testament to their professionalism and skill in covering their tracks. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, The thieves wasted no time in converting the stolen funds into cash. All the accounts at RCBC that had received the $81 million had been opened using fake identities, a common tactic in money laundering operations. The person who facilitated the opening of these accounts was a branch manager named Maya DeGuito. Maya played a crucial role in the heist, not only by helping the thieves set up the accounts, but also by arranging for large amounts of cash to be made available for withdrawal. As soon as the $81 million arrived in the accounts, Maya began preparing the funds for the thieves. She requested significant amounts of cash from neighboring bank branches and coordinated with the thieves to ensure that everything was ready for them to collect. By the end of the week on Friday, she had managed to convert $22 million into the local Philippine currency, the peso. To put that into perspective, $22 million in pesos is an enormous amount of cash, given that the peso is a small denomination currency. Converting $22 million into pesos meant that the thieves were dealing with over 1 million banknotes. The logistics of handling such a large volume of cash were staggering, but Maya and the thieves were well prepared. Bank employees reported seeing Maya personally handling boxes of cash, accompanied by several individuals who helped her load the boxes into a luxury Lexus LX. The vehicle, packed with millions of pesos in cash, then drove off, disappearing into the streets of Manila. By the end of the day, the thieves had successfully converted 22 million of the 81 million into cash, leaving 59 million still in the accounts. While the $22 million had been successfully converted into cash, the remaining $59 million couldn't simply be withdrawn and used freely. The funds were still traceable, as all the money had come from the same source, the Central Bank of Bangladesh, and each note had a serial number that could potentially be tracked. In order to make the money untraceable, the thieves needed to launder it. This was one of the reasons the hackers had chosen the Philippines as the destination for the stolen funds. The country is known for its numerous unregulated casinos and gambling halls, where millions of dollars circulate daily without any real financial oversight. These venues provided the perfect environment for laundering large sums of money. The thieves distributed the remaining $59 million among a group of 10 to 15 individuals, most of whom were Chinese nationals. These individuals were likely not part of the core team of hackers who had executed the heist, but were instead hired to carry out the money laundering process. Their task was simple: take the stolen money to various casinos in the Philippines and launder it by gambling. Once inside a casino, the thieves would exchange the stolen cash for casino chips, effectively changing the form of the money. They would then use the chips to gamble at casino tables, often playing against one another to ensure that they didn't lose any significant amounts of money to outsiders. Whether they won or lost, the money remained within their group, and the casino took only a small commission, typically 1 or 2%, for facilitating the transactions. Once they had finished gambling, the thieves would return the chips to the casino and exchange them back into cash. However, this time, they would receive different banknotes that couldn't be traced back to the original stolen funds. This process allowed them to launder the money, making it nearly impossible to trace. Back in Bangladesh, the central bank was still trying to make contact with RCBC to stop the thieves from accessing the remaining $59 million. Finally, on Tuesday, after the Chinese New Year holiday had ended, RCBC employees returned to work. From the start of the business day, the Central Bank of Bangladesh made every effort to contact the management of the Philippine bank, stressing the urgency of the situation and the massive sums of money at stake. But the central bank's pleas fell on deaf ears. For the first 5 hours of the workday, every person they spoke to at RCBC referred them to someone else. Despite repeatedly explaining the gravity of the situation, the central bank was unable to reach anyone with the authority to freeze the accounts. Finally, after hours of frustrating back and forth, the central bank managed to reach a senior official at RCBC. But by then, it was too late. All of the $81 million had already been withdrawn. The thieves had taken the $22 million in cash on Friday, and over the course of Tuesday morning, the remaining $59 million had been withdrawn from the accounts as well. During those 5 hours, while the Central Bank of Bangladesh was desperately trying to contact RCBC, the thieves had coordinated with Maya DeGuito to withdraw the rest of the money. Maya had facilitated the withdrawals just as she had the first time, but this time it was even easier for her since it was the beginning of the work week. The thieves had managed to take advantage of the central bank's delayed response, and by the time they were able to speak to someone in authority, the money was gone. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Central Bank of Bangladesh's response to the heist was their failure to send representatives to the Philippines to deal with the situation in person. Given the severity of the crisis, it seems logical that the bank would have dispatched someone to be present at RCBC as soon as the holiday ended, to directly request that the accounts be frozen before any further withdrawals could be made. Had they done so, they might have been able to prevent the thieves from withdrawing the remaining $59 million. Instead, the bank's response was remarkably lax, and by the time they fully grasped the scale of the situation, it was too late to stop the theft. In the days and weeks following the heist, news of the theft spread quickly around the world. The media picked up the story, and soon it was being covered by major news outlets worldwide. It was dubbed the biggest digital heist in history, and the scale of the theft shocked the global financial community. The Central Bank of Bangladesh faced widespread criticism for its handling of the crisis, and there were significant resignations in the aftermath, including the governor of the bank and several directors and senior officials. The bank's failure to respond quickly and decisively to the heist had cost the country millions of dollars, and the repercussions were severe. But the question remained, who were the hackers behind this massive operation? Investigations into the Bangladesh bank heist were launched in multiple countries, including Bangladesh, the United States, and the Philippines. Several security agencies and cybercrime experts were brought in to assist, but initially, the investigators had no idea who the hackers were. The thieves had been extremely careful in covering their tracks, and there were very few leads to follow. However, as the investigation progressed, experts began to notice some familiar patterns. After a thorough examination of the malware used in the bank hack, investigators found strong similarities between the code used in the Bangladesh bank heist and the malware used in a previous high-profile cyber attack against Sony Pictures in 2014. That attack on Sony had been one of the most significant cyber breaches in corporate history, disrupting the company's networks, devices, and systems for weeks. The group responsible for the Sony hack was known as the Lazarus Group, a notorious hacking collective believed to be backed by North Korea. The Lazarus Group had made headlines for their bold and damaging cyber attacks, and their connection to the Bangladesh bank heist began to take shape as investigators uncovered more evidence linking them to the malware used in the heist. The Lazarus Group first came to global attention after their 2014 cyber attack on Sony Pictures. The attack was carried out in retaliation for the release of a satirical film called The Interview, which depicted two journalists traveling to North Korea to interview its leader, Kim Jong-un. The film portrayed Kim in an unflattering light, and the North Korean government was not amused. In response, North Korea issued a series of threats against Sony, demanding that the film be pulled from theaters. Most cinemas complied, refusing to show the film out of fear of reprisal. However, there was significant public demand for the film to be released, and Sony eventually made it available for purchase and streaming online. This move angered the North Korean government even further, and shortly after the film's release, Sony was hit with a devastating cyber attack. The Lazarus Group was behind the attack, and they left a trail of destruction in their wake. They paralyzed Sony's networks, forcing the company to revert to pen and paper operations as their digital systems were rendered useless. The hackers also leaked thousands of confidential emails between Sony employees, managers, and even celebrities associated with the company. Some of the leaked emails contained embarrassing scandals and derogatory comments, adding to the damage caused by the attack. It quickly became evident that the Lazarus Group was not just a group of rogue hackers operating independently. They were connected to the North Korean government, which had long been suspected of using cybercrime as a way to fund its activities in the face of international sanctions. However, the exact nature of the Lazarus Group remained unclear. Were they regular employees of the North Korean government, or were they mercenaries working on behalf of the regime? What was certain was that the Lazarus Group had access to state resources, which made them incredibly dangerous. Their attack on Sony was just the beginning, and their involvement in the Bangladesh bank heist underscored their growing reputation as one of the most sophisticated and ruthless hacking groups in the world. The specific codes found within the malware used in the Bangladesh bank hack were a near-perfect match to the code used in the Sony breach. Cybersecurity experts agreed that such a match could only occur if the same individuals were behind both operations. The Lazarus Group's involvement in the Bangladesh bank heist made sense, given the scale and complexity of the operation. From the year-long infiltration of the bank's systems to the coordination of money laundering operations in the Philippines, everything pointed to a large, well-organized group with significant resources at their disposal. In addition to the evidence linking the Lazarus Group to the Bangladesh bank heist, investigators also uncovered connections to Chinese nationals who had been involved in laundering the stolen funds. This discovery further supported the theory that the heist was a large-scale, state-sponsored operation. China is North Korea's main ally and trading partner, and the two countries share a close relationship as well as a border. The Chinese nationals involved in the laundering operation were likely hired to assist with the casino gambling scheme that allowed the thieves to clean the stolen money. Although it was unclear whether these individuals were directly connected to the Lazarus Group or were simply hired as part of the operation, their involvement pointed to a broader, more complex network of actors behind the heist. As the investigation continued, the Lazarus Group was officially classified by many Western countries, including the United States, as one of the most dangerous hacking organizations in the world. While they may not have been the most technically advanced hackers, their ability to cause significant damage was unmatched. This was due in large part to the backing and support they received from North Korea, a rogue state with few qualms about using cybercrime as a tool of economic warfare. However, the Bangladesh bank heist and the Sony hack were not the only reasons the Lazarus Group earned their notorious reputation. In 2017, they launched a devastating cyber attack that would further cement their status as the world's most dangerous hackers. In May 2017, the world was hit by a ransomware attack known as WannaCry. The attack, believed to have been carried out by the Lazarus Group, was one of the largest and most destructive cyber attacks in history. WannaCry was a form of ransomware, a type of malicious software that encrypts a victim's files and demands a ransom in exchange for unlocking them. The ransomware spread rapidly across the globe, infecting hundreds of thousands of computers in over 150 countries. Victims of the attack were greeted with a red screen displaying a message. Their files had been encrypted, and the only way to retrieve them was to pay a ransom of $300 in Bitcoin to a specified wallet address. The message also warned that if the ransom wasn't paid within 3 days, the amount would double to $600. If the payment still wasn't made within a week, the victim's files would be permanently deleted. The problem was that the ransomware didn't always work as intended. Even when victims paid the ransom, there was no guarantee that they would get their files back. In fact, the program had significant bugs, and it appeared that only about 1 in 3 affected computers managed to recover their files after paying the ransom. Despite this, a staggering 57% of victims, both individuals and companies, chose to pay the ransom. It's estimated that the Lazarus Group collected between $70 million and $100 million from the attack. While the ransom payments were significant, they were only part of the story. The real damage caused by WannaCry was the widespread disruption it brought to critical infrastructure around the world. The ransomware hit hospitals, transportation systems, banks, and telecommunications companies, causing chaos and halting essential services. One of the most high-profile victims of the attack was the United Kingdom's National Health Service, NHS, which was forced to cancel thousands of medical appointments and surgeries after WannaCry infected its computer systems. The ransomware disrupted vital healthcare services, putting patients' lives at risk and highlighting the vulnerability of critical infrastructure to cyber attacks. The global damages caused by WannaCry were estimated to be in the billions of dollars, making it one of the most costly cyber attacks in history. It was this attack, more than any other, that cemented the Lazarus Group's status as the world's most dangerous hacker organization. As the investigation into the Bangladesh bank heist continued, it became clear that the Lazarus Group was responsible for the attack. The similarities between the malware used in the heist and the Sony hack, combined with the group's involvement in the WannaCry attack, pointed to a well-established pattern of large-scale, high-profile cybercrime. But despite the extensive investigation and the involvement of multiple international agencies, none of the hackers involved in the Bangladesh bank heist were ever caught. The $81 million that was stolen vanished into the complex web of money laundering schemes in the Philippines, and the core members of the Lazarus Group remained at large. While the hackers managed to evade capture, there was one person who was caught and prosecuted for her role in the heist, Maya DeGito, the branch manager at RCBC who had facilitated the withdrawals. Maya was charged with money laundering, and in a shocking turn of events, she was sentenced to 59 years in prison and fined $19 million, a sum greater than the amount she had helped launder. Maya's conviction raised many questions. Why had she agreed to help the thieves? Had she been bribed, or was there something else motivating her actions? If she had been paid off, why hadn't she fled the country with the money as soon as the heist was discovered? These questions remain unanswered, and the details of her involvement in the heist are still unclear. What is clear, however, is that Maya was the only person prosecuted in connection with the heist. She was in many ways a scapegoat, bearing the brunt of the punishment for a crime that involved a much larger and more complex network of actors. To this day, the Bangladesh bank heist remains the largest digital theft in history. The $81 million stolen by the Lazarus Group was never recovered, and the hackers behind the operation disappeared without a trace. The heist exposed the vulnerabilities of the global financial system and highlighted the growing threat of cybercrime in an increasingly digital world. As the world becomes more reliant on digital infrastructure, the risks of cyber attacks will only continue to grow. The Bangladesh bank heist was a wake-up call for banks and financial institutions around the world, forcing them to reevaluate their cybersecurity measures and prepare for the possibility of future attacks. The heist also underscored the role of state-sponsored hacking groups in the global cybercrime landscape. The Lazarus Group's involvement in the Bangladesh bank heist and other high-profile attacks like WannaCry demonstrated the extent to which nation-states could use cyber attacks as tools of economic warfare. As we move further into the digital age, the line between traditional crime and cybercrime is becoming increasingly blurred. The Bangladesh bank heist was just one example of how vulnerable the global financial system can be, and it serves as a stark reminder that the greatest threats may no longer come from armed robbers or physical intrusions, but from the invisible, intangible world of cyberspace.